I live? Can you hear me? Yes? Good. Can you hear me over the speakers and not just my voice? Okay. You can't hear me back. Now? Anything? Is that better? Better? Front and center, Monsignor? Okay. Yeah. Yes. This good? Yes? There, I can hear now. Okay. Well, thank you to everyone who's here tonight. We had no idea how many to expect, so this is a pleasant surprise. I have to say that as Communications Director, I have myself received a call that was from Monsignor about 18 months ago. I was driving, and I've known Monsignor for many years, ever since he was at the cathedral. I'm a photographer by trade, and I was driving one day, and on my phone, it said, I got a call, and it said, Monsignor Anthony Frontiero, and that was my call, basically, right? So I got a call to come to St. Matthew, so I'm here. And then, of course, being the communications director and doing the advertising for this, it got to be a little laborious because this is a lecture about the calling of St. Matthew at the parish of St. Matthew by Matthew Lomanno, and it just gets a little tedious, right? I'm like, I was wondering if someone was thinking they're actually going to be like joking, right? Like this isn't real, like this can't. But I assure you it's real. I'm here, so thank you. Thank you to Monsignor and the St. Matthew Parish community for the invitation to speak about the work of one of the greatest, if not most controversial artists in the history of Christendom. Indeed, when many hear the name Caravaggio, his moral and legal difficulties come to mind first, prior to and despite his profound and lasting contributions to painting, to art, and to Catholic culture. My task is to reflect on these through a series of 3 lectures, specifically regarding his life of St. Matthew, made on commission for a chapel in Rome. More on that soon. But first, I suggest that we must begin more broadly. If I had been asked to discuss a particular moral question, for example, I wouldn't just begin talking about it. Rather, I would begin with a general understanding of relevant moral principles, how others have approached and answered the problem, why they're all wrong, etc. Thus, I shall begin this evening with perhaps a brief discussion of art, then more specifically fine art, and then finally the work before us this evening. By art, I am referring to anything made by humans. That is, whatever is not given by nature. So this is a very broad category, right? A tree is natural. This lectern is an object of art. A dog is natural. A domesticated dog is bred and trained, and thus not completely natural. He is a mix of nature and art. We are currently surrounded by, sitting on, wearing, listening to, looking at objects of art. The church, the pews, our clothing, my words, the screen, and the painting, these are all art objects. Art is made for different reasons or goals, or in the terminology of philosophy, ends. Buildings, for example, are made for shelter. Cars are made for travel. Computers and screens are made for work and entertainment. A lectern is made to hold notes and lean on intently. These goals are useful or productive, and most art is made for this reason. Right? So in the broad category of art, most art is actually useful. We call an object good or bad to the degree at which it fulfills its goal. If a car starts intermittently, doesn't change gears well, or breaks down often, we judge it to be a bad car. Winter's coming, I'm just thinking of all the things that could go wrong with my car, right? If a knife doesn't cut well and easily through a variety of foods, it's a bad knife. This is not good or bad in the moral sense, for that can be only said of humans. Rather, good and bad regarding useful objects refers to what degree it functions according to its specified end or goal. Another kind of art exists. Group 2. Perhaps you noticed that I chose not to wear my sackcloth tunic tonight. I noticed none of you are either. nor did I choose to wear my hair shirt or my animal pelt or any number of highly functional, yet not quite appropriate attire. Note also how this church is not only designed, but adorned in a particular way. The same is true for our cars, our homes, and many other aspects of our life. The functional objects we use are sometimes made to look and feel pleasing. This is the second kind of art, decorative. I won't spend too long on this, but note we say of an outfit or a car or a building, that looks good, or not so much, right? This is an entirely separate judgment from its function. A knife could cut very well but be plain to look at. A car could be reliable but lacking in design. And clothing could be durable and even fit well without looking good on a particular body. Now, as interesting as the useful and decorative arts are, what most, if not all, think of when we say the word art is fine art, or the arts of the beautiful. But speaking about other kinds of art was necessary so that we may better understand what the fine arts are and how they differ from those other two kinds. For the useful arts are valued not for their own sake. The useful arts are not valued for their own sake, but for the sake of using them for some purpose. So I don't really understand people who collect cars. I mean, a lot of cars. I mean, I have a neighbor who had this old 50s car, and it's beautiful. It has one, right? And he takes it out about once a week, and but I'm talking about people who collect dozens and dozens of cars. Like, you can't drive all those, right? How does that, I mean, if you could drive maybe one a week, but they don't. They just kind of have them in a garage and they sit there and have someone take it. So it's not, I mean, they're treated as almost fine art objects, right? But that's not really what a car is for. A car is made to be driven. The decorative arts require adorning an object that has some useful or practical function. Walls are needed for a building to exist, but how they are adorned is mostly a secondary consideration. Right? The fine arts, by contrast, exist for the sake of their own beauty. That beauty is found within the object itself, not some further purpose or goal. Thus, it is the contrary of the useful arts. But what is beautiful, and how do we define it? All right, so I'm behind a little bit on my slide, but why do we call them fine, or for their own sake? They're for the sake of beauty, and the beauty is found within the object itself. It doesn't go farther beyond that, right? There's nothing further that we look to when we say this painting or this sculpture or this building is beautiful. It's just it's contained within it. So what is beautiful? How do we define it? This question is so often ignored, and I listen to a lot of lectures on beauty and art. Within even my own tradition, I'm an Aristotelian and Thomist by training. And it's remarkable to me how many scholars of any discipline just kind of gloss over this question, right? It seems that oh, you know what that is, right? We don't need to talk about it. Well, actually, there's a lot of confusion about it. And there's a lot of other philosophers in different traditions who say different things. And so I think clarity on this question is crucial. So we'll look to St. Thomas Aquinas. The angelic doctor, medieval philosopher, theologian, born well before and alive well before Caravaggio. But he is one of the most both original and synthetic minds in the Christian philosophical and theological tradition. St. Thomas says, "The beautiful is that which pleases when apprehended." That which pleases when apprehended. Two primary notes here. First, the beautiful is sensible, but only what is seen or what can be heard. What can be seen or heard can be beautiful, according to Thomas, because those are the most rational of the senses. Secondly, recognizing the beautiful requires reason. Non-rational beings apprehend objects only as they are to be pursued or avoided, as promoting or threatening their survival. Rational beings, however, can acknowledge an object as beautiful without reference to our own physical or moral good, right? So this is a very much an embodied understanding. This is a full, for Aquinas, we're not disembodied minds, right? We are sensible and sensing creatures. And we use our senses that informs our intellect, and we can recognize something as beautiful, either we see it or we heard. I heard for the first time, he's been here for a few weeks or maybe even more than a month now, but this is the first time I've heard our new music director, Eric, sing. And wow, I mean, it's just, you know, I'm not supposed to be, but I'm always a little bit jealous of tenors. I'm sorry. So they can just do things that I can't, so. All right, so we are pleased by seeing or hearing beautiful objects, but again, why? How is it that those things please us? According to St. Thomas, the source of our pleasure derives from our apprehension or recognition of order within the object. We apprehend the object, we recognize its order, and that experience pleases us. That's it. It's actually very simple. It's complex, but not complicated for St. Thomas. We apprehend the object, the order is recognized, and that experience pleases us. St. Thomas says, these sensations are pleasurable in themselves. Of course, he is a monk, or not a monk, he's a Dominican who has regularly, he lived most of his life in Paris, where he taught and wrote, but he frequently traveled. He's to Italy and Rome. He saw much of the developed Christian world. He knows beautiful churches. He knows beautiful paintings and sculptures, and even if it's older medieval style that we wouldn't acknowledge today, he recognizes how it is that we call those things beautiful or not. For those of you wondering, St. Thomas also accounts for non-sensible or spiritual beauty, but that's a separate matter, to such a degree that an object or a person being one is entirely distinct from another. So I don't have that listed here, but the spiritually beautiful really is a function of, in humans, virtue. Virtue is not sensible, okay? It's of an entirely different order of being from what is sensible. So the sensibly beautiful and the spiritually beautiful are two entirely different things. We can say both things are beautiful, but in different ways, and we always have to kind of specify how we're using that word, okay? How does St. Thomas understand order regarding the beautiful object? He says there are three kinds of order: integrity or perfection. Is it one thing? Does it appear to be one thing, okay? The trick with art, right, is that it's, as we said before, it's constructed. It doesn't have I'm a human being, right? I have one nature, and that nature, my soul, informs my whole being. That makes me an integral, perfected being in some way. Same is true of an angel, same is true of all of you, right? Artistic objects don't have that unity, right? If we broke down this pew, right, it wouldn't turn back into a tree, right? It's done being a tree, right? And the only thing that holds it together is some screws and glue and not taking a sledgehammer to it, okay? And once you do that, it's apart and it doesn't have any more integrity, okay? So right now, it's being held together. That's a kind of perfection or imposed unity on an object. Proportion or harmony. This is regarding the parts and the whole, okay? Let's say that the pew backs were twice as tall, okay? This is disproportionate for a number of reasons. One, right, we don't need, people would lean their heads back during Mass and fall asleep, right? So that's one reason why it's bad. The other reason why is you, man, would not be able to see in front, right? So this is, we're losing the functionality of this thing, right? So it's not proportionate and it's not suitable to be a seat. In the fine arts, there are certain parts that are arranged. We're going to talk a lot about the parts of this painting very soon. And those parts are arranged in a very particular way, okay? If they're arranged in a pleasing way, we say it's beautiful, and if not, then we say it's deficient in some way, okay? And finally, clarity. Clarity is a little bit, it's a little bit ambiguous, but the idea basically is that we can see it all at once. We can experience it all at once, and it's clear to us. So I'll talk about the dimensions, these actual dimensions of this, of the real painting here. It's about 10 feet square, okay? It's massive, all right? So if I had not given you little cards, right? And I had put one of them up here and said, okay, we're gonna look at this painting today, you wouldn't see it, right? It lacks clarity, okay? Because it's unable to be seen. I've experienced other paintings. I was a graduate student at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and on the wall of the library, which went up 2 stories in the inside wall, I mean, this painting must have been 30 feet tall, maybe 40, and 25 feet wide. And even if you stood back 50 feet from it, you really couldn't take it all in. And if you stepped back that far to actually be able to see the whole thing, you couldn't see the parts. So it lacked clarity in that sense, right? And its proportion also failed. Okay. How is this so far? Are we good? Okay, good. Thank you. Thus, one's reaction of this is beautiful or that is ugly is not a feeling or emotion, but a judgment of reason. Articulating why one has a reaction, a particular reaction, can be difficult, right? We all experience things. We see some paintings in a museum or in a gallery, and we say, I like that, I don't like that, right? But we don't necessarily are able to articulate why. Articulating can be difficult because, let's be honest, most people are untrained to do so. And I like to think of an analogy with sports here. We're all Americans, at least in this room, as far as I know. Has anyone ever tried to watch cricket? Okay, did you understand anything that was going on there? A ball, good, yes, yes. They take it's like a paddle and whack a ball, and everyone runs around a little bit, and if you don't know the rules of the game, it's really hard to find any kind of order within it, right? And I imagine that most people would have the same reaction watching American football or baseball, which is, I mean, people in the US grow up with baseball from here, right? But the rules are very obscure, and sometimes the ball is good, and sometimes the ball is bad, and why? And sometimes you swing, and sometimes you don't, right? I mean, it's very confusing, right? So if you don't know the rules, if you haven't been trained in it, you certainly don't know what's going on, and you also don't know if it's a good play or not, right? The experience of watching, having someone guide you through that, right? You have someone on your shoulder saying, okay, this is what's happening here, and why is it in baseball that if you get a hit 1 out of 3 times, you're an all-star? If you're a basketball player and you make 1 out of every 3 shots, not so good, right? Right? So we need experience, we need training to understand these things. So I'm hoping that what we're doing tonight will work on that a little bit. So we're getting close to Caravaggio. Every work of fine art has a history peculiar to itself. What we can know about that history ranges from nothing to being fully documented. There's this it's kind of post-medieval, but before Shakespeare, this Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Has anyone ever heard of that text? It was discovered, I think, in the 19th century in a library, in the British Isles somewhere. We know nothing of the author, right? All we have is this text, right? We have no history. We can just place it, its timeline just kind of by the language it uses, and that's it. That's all we know, right? And if you look to the 20th century, there are works of art that we have an incredible amount of detail about the process in which they were made, the sketches, right? What worked, what didn't, how the artist changed it, right? We know a wide range. Caravaggio's works fall in the middle. We have a lot of information about some works and a little about others. All of that comes from either those who commissioned the works or those who bought it. Nothing from Caravaggio himself. He has almost no writings, which is pretty uncommon at the time. Indeed, of his dozens of paintings, he seemed to have signed only one, let alone kept records of his work. Caravaggio was born Michelangelo Maurizi da, from Caravaggio, in 1571. Now, we recently discovered he's actually not even from, he wasn't even born in Caravaggio. He was born in Milan, and then his parents moved when they were at a young age to a small town just outside of Milan, Caravaggio, and that's kind of where he obviously picked up his name. Okay, so eventually it was just shortened to Caravaggio. What's happening in the 16th century? Again, this will be very, very brief. Michelangelo, the famous Michelangelo, the more famous Michelangelo perhaps. Maybe that's why he chose Caravaggio, because like we've already gotten to Michelangelo, right? So what can I do? Right, so Michelangelo died just 7 years before Caravaggio was born. He died at age 88, which means the Italian Renaissance had been underway for about 75 years, okay? On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther presented his 95 Theses, beginning the Protestant Reformation. And the Council of Trent, the final meeting of the Council of Trent was held in 1563. It was a council that lasted almost 20 years. Thus, the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation, known as the Counter-Reformation, was fully underway at the time in 1571. Okay. This is going to be a very brief, there's a lot to his career. We know bits and pieces, but he was apprenticed to a painter in Milan in 1584 when he was 13 years old. He stayed there for 4 years. He lingered in Milan for a while and then moved to Rome, probably for, let's say, legal reasons, at the age of 21, where he paints in the employment of some various studios. He was actually very good at painting still lifes, so like fruit and flowers were kind of his specialty, and so he would get employed by at a painter's studio that was established, and he would kind of do that work. Okay, so let's say there's a big, the master painter had a big commission, and he would do that. Okay, he would do those. He eventually became under the patronage of some various individuals and clerics, including some cardinals. And he receives his first public commission in 1599, so he's already been in Rome for 7 years. He's kind of bouncing from house to house, just looking for work, looking for a patron to put him up and feed him decently, things like that. All right, this is his first public commission, okay? In 1599, he receives his first public commissions for 2 paintings for a side chapel in the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi. These paintings are to portray the calling and the martyrdom of St. Matthew. The commission for the calling reads as follows. St. Matthew, so this is what the commission is. So the cardinal who's funding this says, this is what I want. He writes it up, hands it to Caravaggio, and says, can you do this? And Caravaggio says, yes. But this is the level of detail, okay. St. Matthew in a tax collector's office with different things that are needed in such an office with a table, like tax collectors used, with books and money. From that table, St. Matthew, dressed as was fitting in his profession, rises with the desire to come to our Lord, who, passing through the street with his disciples, calls him. All right? So it's a fairly detailed list. There's a lot of things happening here. This is longer than the passage that we're going to read in a minute from the Bible, okay? This description of what's happening in this painting is longer than the actual call of St. Matthew, as we have it in the scripture, okay? Now, as complicated as the scene described is, it was not an uncommon request. Scenes from the Bible were often requested for public or private works of art, including sculptures, windows, and paintings. It's meant to depict the biblical account from Matthew 9:9. As Jesus passed from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the customs post. He said to him, "Follow me," and he got up and followed him. That's it. That's what we have. All right? So the cardinal is adding, more description, right, than what we actually have. Now, I want to show a couple examples of the other callings of St. Matthew, okay? There are other paintings about the calling of St. Matthew, right? This is a tradition, right? So we're going to look first at Vittorio Carpaccio's calling of St. Matthew from 1502. So this is almost 100 years prior. This is nearly 100 years prior, okay? Here's the table, right? We have a sense of the table. Obviously, St. Matthew, look how St. Matthew is dressed here. He's dressed like a tax collector, right? He's got brocade and embroidered clothing, right? Everyone else is wearing plain and simple cloaks and garments, right? He does a good job showing a lot of the architecture and the area. Presumably, this is Renaissance architecture. This is not, right, ancient Jerusalem architecture. Okay, and just to get a little bit of a close-up there, we see the interaction between Matthew and Jesus takes his hand, okay? Another example is Marinus de, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna get, Reymerswale's calling of St. Matthew from about 30 years later, okay? These ones on the left are the full dimensions of the painting. This is not a crop. So again, what do we see here? And just from the descriptive elements, right? Lots of writing, lots of tags. This looks like if you've ever been in the kitchen of a restaurant, right? It looks like they're putting up the orders for the tag, right? Again, this is what a tax collector's office may have looked like in Renaissance Belgium, right? But probably not what it looked like in Jesus' day. That's okay. But again, we get it's pretty clear who Matthew and Jesus is here, right? There's no. He's just kind of looking at him, right? It's just a visual, right? There's no reaching out. There's no pointing. And Matthew seems to be kind of submitting, if you will, in a kind of act of obedience, right? He's just he recognizes who Jesus is, and everyone else is kind of doing their own thing, right? They're not paying attention, right? Okay. And I tried to get a close up here, but just to kind of see the interaction between them. But there's a lot going on, right? And again, we get some architecture in the background. It's highly unlikely that Caravaggio ever saw these, but I mentioned them to illustrate I mentioned them both to illustrate the shared subject matter during this time and to contrast Caravaggio's own treatment. The calling, so he receives a commission for two, right? We're only talking about one, right? He receives a commission for the calling and the martyrdom, okay? The inspiration, which you can see through the window there, the inspiration comes later, okay? So these are meant to be on either side of the chapel. The calling was completed first, either that same year, 1599, or 1600, and the martyrdom was completed by 1601. The two paintings are nearly identical in size, 10.5 feet by 11 feet. These paintings are very large, right? These are, and I have to say, Caravaggio's oil on canvas paintings, along with the later third one, remain in the chapel today, over 400 years later, as our recent pilgrims to Italy can attest. They were able to see them there. I'm not jealous at all, not jealous at all. To be able, so, and what else is remarkable is that the paintings are still there, right? I mean, that they haven't been moved elsewhere. They haven't been moved to a museum. They're still part of the chapel in which they were designed for, which is wonderfully impressive. Okay, the painting. If we are to hold fast to what St. Thomas has discerned regarding why an object is said to be beautiful, then we must examine the painting by describing it accurately and analyzing it carefully. All right, so we talked about those kinds of order, right? And so now I'm going to show you what I think that order looks like on this painting. And you can look here, you can look here. Okay, this is, yeah. The first thing that stands out to me is shape. This is almost a perfect square. As I said, it's about 10.5 by 11. The whole painting is ordered with a series of rectangles and squares. The group of 5 figures on the left form the first main square. Jesus and his disciple to the right form a tall rectangle. And we're going to break down more of this later. Obviously, the window above, the shutter. And sorry, I'm not going to discuss this more, but obviously this more, right? More rectangles within, right? So it's a framing where he has rectangle within rectangle within rectangle. I'm going to just a little bit more breakdown here of just this group. All the heads here are within that rectangle above the table, okay? The table itself, obviously a rectangle. Now, it's because of the foreshortening, because of the perspective, we don't actually see what the table shape is. It could be a square, it could be a rectangle, but relative to us, the viewer, it's a rectangle. The stool that the young boy is sitting on, rectangle. And even the shape formed within the legs of St. Matthew, right? Another, so we have horizontal rectangle, vertical rectangle, right? While the primary principle of organization is the rectangle, Caravaggio creates a series of diagonals to contrast the right angles. This is not going to be an exhaustive list because there are so many diagonals in this painting, but just to give you a sense of the diagonals, right? So the main one cuts across the entire composition from the window, the unseen window here, let's say pretend it's here, right? Through the halo of Jesus, right? Down to his hand, right down to St. Matthew, okay? Cuts across almost perfectly in half at an angle. The smaller diagonals that I'll point out now create a set of counterpoints to the right angles of the primary shapes. So this might be hard, I don't know, can you see the other smaller ones? Okay, so this gentleman here has a sword, right? Almost at a perfect 90-degree angle to the main diagonal, right? We don't know which disciple this is, but he's obviously at a strong angle, right? He's not vertical, he's leaning in towards St. Matthew. Now I can't even see. Okay. St. Matthew's legs, as much as they create a rectangle that we just here, he's at an angle 90 degrees to this gentleman's upper thigh, but also 90 degrees to his own leg. And then this gentleman with the sword, he has right angles relative to the sword of his legs, right? And also another bent leg there, his other leg. All right, so you can see there are a lot more, right? The clothing that they're wearing has its own diagonals. right? There's a lot going on here. It's wonderfully complex. Next, light. Now, might be a little bit of a philosopher's peculiarity here, but light is in quotation marks here because, of course, when we're talking about a painting, we're not talking about actual light, right? We're talking about the imitation of light through paint, right? Brighter paint, darker paint, right? This might seem an obvious and trivial point, but for the sake of clarity, we should always recognize that, at least regarding painting, everything about them is illusion and construction in order to achieve a desired effect. That's not a bad thing. That's what painting does, okay? The painter's skill is to manipulate color in order for us to think that this two-dimensional surface actually has depth, right? That there's actually light, right? There's actually figures there, right? They're not, and that's okay, right? That's what they're supposed to be doing. Caravaggio uses a technique called chiaroscuro to illuminate virtual volume throughout the painting. Chiaroscuro employs an alternating use of bright and dark tones as if from directional light to create high contrast effects. All right, so this is pretty clear. And it's even, I mean, I've enjoyed studying some of Caravaggio's work throughout his career in preparation for this. And this is really a departure. A lot of his earlier work, the light is much more front lit. The light is much more front positioned on the subjects, right? Much more of their figures are illumined. Here, it's very directional, right? And it produces this alternating bright and darkness, okay? So this is actually the brightest spot in the entire painting, right? And then we get a really dark shadow here. This is one of the darkest spots here, right? Matches all the other tones, right? And then brightness, and then it's pretty dark. It's not as dark as the other ones. And then almost complete darkness. This is called negative space. There's a lot of negative space in this painting, right? This is almost a third, if you're breaking it up into a tic-tac-toe, right? This is almost a third of it is nothing but black, okay? And then we see on the bottom half here, darkness, light, darkness, all the way up until this gentleman's face, right? Bright, dark, bright, dark, bright, almost all dark down here, right? We see a little bit of reflected light for their legs, and then brightness, darkness, brightness. I mean, it's just that pattern throughout, right? And there are variations, but it's that that you see over and over again. He uses that pattern to illuminate the figures in certain ways, okay? This technique allows Caravaggio to show and accent various parts of the scene to be noticed by the viewer, including faces, hands, clothing, legs, and to de-emphasize others. He wants us to see certain things in this painting. He doesn't want us to see other things, right? What he wants us to see, he illuminates with a brighter tone. What he doesn't want us to see, what he wants us to ignore, are in darkness, right? We don't need to see what's behind Jesus. We don't need to see anything here. There's nothing here, right? He doesn't want us looking up here. But instead of having a canvas that, looks like a Tetris piece, right? No, we have a square canvas, right? So he has to do something with it. He has to direct our eye in certain ways. And this is how we do it. This is how he does it. Next, the analysis of plane. Again, plane in scare quotes. When we say plane in a painting, we refer to the effect of creating virtual planes of depth on a two-dimensional surface by the use of perspective. The foreground is what appears to be closest to the viewer. The midground is usually where the main subjects are placed, and the background appears to be the furthest from the viewer. So we'll show you what that looks like. The foreground, this stool and this gentleman here are closest to us, right? Most of the other figures here, St. Matthew and the older gentleman and this young boy, are in the midground along with Jesus notably the hands, right? And then, of course, the background is the whole wall behind them, okay? This effect is created by making foreground figures and objects slightly larger, the midground more detailed, and the background darker, muted, or with less detail. So if you have the opportunity to look at a scene like this with a real painting, you get really close as the museum will let you get, without setting off an alarm, right? And you can see what the painter does, right? To give us the of depth, right? What you see is that the details are much less sharp, right? Because if we're looking out in the world, as you look far away, I can see right out through the trees across, right? It's not very sharp, right? We don't want, and the painter doesn't want that much detail on the background. One of the things that if you go back and look at those other paintings, you'll notice how sharp the background is and how actually distracting it is from the scene below, right? It can be really distracting. Like the painter wants to show all that detail, but it's not good. It doesn't fit the human eye to have that level of detail in the background if you're wanting to show things that are happening in the foreground, okay? All right, and this is really the final part of the analysis here, and probably the longest, but it'll go quickly. The subjects. We have a lot of them. The final part of the compositional analysis I'd like to mention this evening is arrangement and the organization of the figures. Because of the overall composition we've already discussed, we shall begin with St. Matthew and the group who surround him. All right, so we'll get nice and close here, okay? And I'm just going to describe them. There's nothing that's going to change on there. So 5 individuals, most of whom are sitting in close proximity to each other. Right, the only one who's standing is this gentleman here, right in the back. They're all facing to the right, although only the 3 central figures notice the 2 figures who have entered, Jesus and his disciple. The 2 on the far left are looking down at what has been collected. So these are looking down, these are looking to the right, okay? They're all dressed in fine contemporary to Caravaggio attire to denote their status. They are organized symmetrically around St. Matthew, but are asymmetrically positioned relative to each other. That is, each has a different pose, okay? So if we're just looking at the square, right, with a group of the tax collectors, St. Matthew is dead in the middle, okay? There's 2 figures on each side, but each of their poses is varied, okay? We see his back, we see his front, okay? We see him from the side, and he's standing, we just kind of really see his head, right? They're all varied, right? If you do the same thing, it gets boring, right? Even with figures like this. Because of the light coming from the right, nearly all of their faces are fully illuminated, right? Different angles, but we can see their faces most clearly, right? Because they've turned towards the light. These 2 we don't see quite as clearly. We get a little bit more accents, right? We get his forehead, right? We get his nose and mouth a little bit. If you're up close enough, you can see their eyes. You can see more features, but obviously but it's meant to be obscured, okay? Note the contrast between these 5 and Jesus with his disciple. Jesus and the disciple are standing versus the other group is sitting. They face the left. The other group faces the right. They are dressed simply as opposed to being fancy, Renaissance fancy at least. The disciple nearly entirely obscures the figure of Jesus, and he faces away from the viewer, right? You can get as close as you want. You really can't see this disciple's face. We don't identify him as one person in particular. It's possible it's Peter, right? I mean, we just don't know. All we see is his back. Again, because of the light, we only see small identifiable portions of these 2 because the light is behind them, right? It's not illuminating their face, and they're facing away from the light. So we see the disciples' back mostly, his hand, a bit of his face. It's kind of and that's really from the reflected light. It's not direct light. We see Jesus' cheek, neck, wrist, and hand, all contrasted against the dark background. Again, notice how dark this is versus how bright this is, right? We can see the outline of his nose because the background is so dark and so black. We only see the bit of his hand here because the background is entirely black, and the same for the disciple's hand, okay? These are all intentional effects so that Caravaggio can show us what he wants to show us. The other major element here are the hands. We only see a few, and the brightest of them are Matthew's pointing at himself and the seated figures counting. Of them all, only of the ladders, only this gentleman here, do we see both his hands. Every other subject shows only one hand. He is fully occupied with his task as is the figure standing over him, holding his glasses and checking the results. Notice also the height and arrangement of the pointing hands. Jesus is the highest, then the disciples, as if to reinforce or clarify the Lord's request, and then Matthew's. It's all that, it's a pattern, right, of that same hand pointing, the same gesture in different slight variations, right? Also, I didn't put this in, but does this hand look familiar to anyone, right? So Caravaggio would have known of Michelangelo's painting in the Sistine Chapel with the creation of Adam, right, where God is pointing in the same direction, right? God is on that painting, God is on the right, and Adam's on the left, and God points out, and it's famous, one of the most famous elements of, right? So it's that kind of similar hand, right, and God is reaching down, right? So again, the same kind of gesture. Of the three hands that are pointing, Matthew's is actually the strongest, the firmest, as if to say, along with his expression, who, me? Right? Like, are you serious? Like, are you clarifying this pointing because that actually, like, that's what you want, right? Right. In conclusion, with the calling of St. Matthew, Caravaggio established himself as a master, and his works over the remainder of his brief life had a profound effect on his contemporaries and the future of European painting. By the next century, however, he was mostly forgotten until the mid-20th century when art historians rediscovered his work and influence. My hope is that this presentation this evening has articulated, at least in part, why his work is held in such high regard, and I eagerly anticipate offering the same next time when we'll discuss the inspiration of St. Matthew. Thank you. Questions? He was just under 30. He died at 38. So, yeah. So I will get into more of his life as the other lectures proceed, but I had so much work to do on the front end with kind of philosophy background that I wanted to, yeah, go ahead, yeah. I love this guy, so you're my only source. How old was he when he did the one with Doug and Thomas put his finger into the wound? We were just looking at that, Sandy and I were just talking about that, and I looked it up to show her. And it was about the same time. This is just within like 2 years of this, maybe even less, around the same time. Yeah.
Looking at that, because it's dark behind Jesus, could you say the light is coming from Jesus? That he's the light of the world?
Yeah, I mean, this is the other thing here, right? Is that this light is separate from this light. Right. Okay, so there's an unseen window here, right? So there's this window that's unseen, but there's also this one, right? So there's certainly kind of certain theological implications that are involved here, right? And obviously Matthew is looking towards the light, right? Both in a figurative way, right? In a theological way, maybe in a physical way. Yeah.
All that darkness around him, and he's being called out of the darkness into the light, which is coming from Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Matthew, you talked about the squares, the diagonals. Was that a style then? Like, did he paint that like that on purpose, or did it just there it was?
We could see from the other examples, and I didn't want to do a complete analysis of those, obviously, but you can see they were very different, right? They're organized very differently, right? We see at the same time with Caravaggio, a much simpler composition, but also a much more interesting, much more dynamic, and much more ordered work of art, it seems to me. So I think he was absolutely doing these things on purpose. Whether he could articulate them is a different question. The artist doesn't need to be able to articulate the things that I did, right? The artist says, this needs to be here, this needs to be here, this needs, he balances, he proportions, right? But he might not have a kind of structure in mind, right? And one of the things that we see in artists when you look at either their sketches, or one of the things that they can do is take x-rays of paintings right now to see previous versions, and it's often the case that painters have removed a figure, right, or changed the position of a figure, right, and they just paint it out, right? And remarkably, Caravaggio was criticized in his day because he didn't do a lot of sketch work before, right? So usually you'd sketch it out on the canvas first with a pencil, and then start painting. He just started painting.
I'm so curious.
Right.
Where the paint brush touched first. Like,
Right. Yeah.
was his first mark.
And usually those are very technical things, right? So it's usually a primer coat that's usually dark. So usually you get your dark, I think you get your darks first, and then you highlight afterwards. So, yeah.
When you compare this painting to the others that were the call of St. Matthew that you showed us, this one has more depth, both in the painting, I think. I'm not much of an art scholar, but also because of that depth in the painting, I think you get the depth of the call of Christ to Matthew. Kind of like, so you get that theological and that, I don't know, it just seems to hit you a little bit different than the others.
Yeah, I mean, and it's fun. It's interesting that you say that you get more depth, because actually those other scenes, they were outside, and you actually could see much more of the background, right? You could see very far away, other buildings and things like that. And so Caravaggio brings us to this very intimate scene, this very small scene, right? It's not on the side. It was supposed to be on the street, but this looks like a room, right? And Jesus is, supposed to be, walking by. Well, he's in there with him, right? And so, and yet, because of the effect, right? Because of the effect of the light and the dark, it does feel that much. It feels much more intimate. It feels, and you do get that sense of depth much more than the other paintings. I agree. Yeah.
Going back to the description of the beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
and the descriptors that Aquinas used
Mm-hmm.
to define what beautiful is, does that apply universally to time in other cultures? The beautiful, in the eye of the beholder, is so subjective.
Yeah, I do think that what Aquinas was stating was stating for all time, and if it's true for Western art, it's going to be true for Eastern art, and it's going to be true for primitive art, and it's going to be true for modern art, right? The principles are very general, right? And I do think they can be applied across the board. The danger with art, judging art, is that we bring so many preconceptions to what something should look like that we don't allow ourselves to see it as for what it is on its own, right? So If you look at classical sculpture versus Rodin, right? Rodin's very rough, right? It's not finished in a sense, right? It's still beautiful, right? But if we have as a principle that sculpture has to be smooth and perfectly articulated, and then yes, Rodin fails. But there are no rules like that in art, right? There are conventions, right? This is what things happen like for right now. And then major shifts in art history are when an artist decides to do something other than those rules, right? Now, in terms of your question about art, beauty being in the eye of the beholder, St. Thomas would disagree, and so would I, okay? We can have disagreements about that, about what beautiful is, just as we have disagreements about what is a good action and what is an evil action, right? And we can have that discussion, and if you came to me and said, I don't think this painting is worth a dime, I'd be happy to talk to you about it, and we can, and say, well, this is why I think it's beautiful, and you can tell me your reasons why you don't think it's beautiful. Ultimately, though, and this is why I think St. Thomas is so helpful, we have to look to the object itself, right? We have to point to this thing and talk about this thing, right? And so if you come to me and say, well, I can't see Jesus' face. This can't really be a good religious painting if I can't see Jesus' face. Okay, well that's a preconception that you have, right, about what a religious painting should be, but is that always true, right? And so we can talk through those things and disagree and kind of tease them out. You have something else?
How was Picasso first, the reaction of people to his first works?
Picasso was a classically trained painter, so his Cubist period didn't happen until a little bit later in his life. So you look at his early work, and you wouldn't even know it was Picasso. And he was part of a major avant-garde movement in Paris at the time. He wasn't the only one doing different things. But that said, some of his most well-known paintings, he worked on for a long time, and his other painter friends, like Matisse, said, this is not good. And they ended up being wrong, I think, because a lot of people say, like, this is, and that's not his Cubist stuff. There are other things, right, that he did before then. Mademoiselle d'Avignon, the figure of 5 women. It is rather Cubist, but the artists in his circle did not like it, even. And he showed them privately. It wasn't a public showing. By then, Guernica was a response to a bombing in Spain, and he was already a well-established painter, but internationally famous, and that was on display. He made that on display for a world fair, and so by then he was, people recognized it for what it was. It was also a massive canvas. He spent quite some time working on that, and the reaction overall was very good, very positive. Yeah.
Do you know, was he also commissioned for the Doubting Thomas, or was he only commissioned for a couple of these?
He was commissioned for a lot. Most of his, as far as I know, almost all of his religious paintings were commissions.
So someone gave him directions and said what they want in this painting, the table, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody commissioned him to represent Doubting Thomas
Yep.
with his finger in, and it never really happened.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's yeah. So he's a friend, and I don't want to get too far, but
Never really happened, but
we're right. Exactly.
to me is what it inspires you to think about. And
Right.
you've given me more things to look at, so it's beyond what my eyes see, it's what it does for me too.
Right.
So he represented an action that didn't happen, but yet.
Well, but remember the scripture though, because Jesus says, "Put your hand in my wounds," right? He doesn't. We don't hear that Thomas did that, but Jesus invites him to do it.
So here's my whackness. As soon as Doubting Thomas walks through the room, finally they get him to come.
Mm-hmm.
And there he is, and says, put your finger in the end. Being in his presence, he just went down and said, my Lord, my God. He didn't have to.
Right. Of course. Right.
But the depiction, okay, is what blows me away, because we're all Doubting Thomases at some point. And my question is, would I have to put my finger in? 60 inches by 40 inches.
Yeah.
That one.
Yep.
And
Good, thank you. You're welcome. You're welcome. Any other questions? Yeah.
Any thoughts or conclusions we can draw from the different outfits? Like there's obviously Matthew and his cohorts are dressed in very Renaissance style, and then Jesus in his, very outfit of his day.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, I mean, we can't see too much of Jesus, right? So it's Jesus and the disciples are wearing kind of cloaks or very simple garments, and these are very very ornate, very stylish, very expensive, according to the time in which Caravaggio would have. So instead of Caravaggio trying to portray a rich tax collector in Jesus' day, what would that look like, right? He doesn't really know, and his people, his audience doesn't know. He's going to make him look rich as they were rich then, right? When he was speaking. And just a high level of ornamentation, right? Lots of colors, lots of stripes, right? These are all very expensive things, right? And so remember the commission was to show the tax collector as he, needing all the things that a tax collector would, and that would be part of it, right? The fancy hat, right? The tights, I guess, right? Right. This is if you were a well-to-do, tax collector or businessman in the Renaissance, this is probably what you'd be wearing. I think and versus the simplicity of Jesus, right? Jesus and his disciples, I mean, they were poor, right? Yeah. Yes. I don't know if there was any pause between the two. The question was, did the cardinal have to sign off on this one before Caravaggio started the second? I'm not sure. There happened, we don't know if he painted them concurrently, or if he did one at a time. But we do know, here's a little spoiler, that the first version of the inspiration of St. Matthew was rejected. Okay, so you're seeing version 2 back there, right? So we'll get into that next time. But as far as I know, both of these were accepted without hesitation.
Do they have any photos of, not photos, but
So tragically, the original was destroyed in World War II, but we do have some black and white photos. So I will be talking about that. We'll show what we can of the original, the inspiration. Yeah. Anything else? Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I think Sandy does. You know Sandy? Okay, yeah. You're welcome.
Awesome.
Oh, you're welcome.
Wonderful.
You're
You
welcome.
guys you're great.
I'm glad you liked it. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
good.
It was
Nice.
no,
Nicely
good.
done.
Thank you.
Nice presentation.
Thank you.
I love the way you did that, too.
Thank you. Yeah, I was happy for this. This
Yeah.
is
Perfect.
yeah, it is perfect for this. Yeah.
Good. How are you, young man?
I noticed. I not a good bump. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I'm gonna go to the office and move the camera angle back now, so you don't have to worry about that. I don't know
Okay.
if you were thinking.
Okay. Thank you.
Because I couldn't see this guy's face.
Yeah. I'll put it up on the pew. So just so you can.
When I went to Rome, we were just talking about it. The conversion of Saul.
Mm-hmm.
Something Church of the People. Do I have the right name?
Maybe I'm not
It was-
sure where it is.
Okay, because it was like I think it was Plaza of the People, and I think it was